Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition in the One Bear, One Book series. My name is Sean Sipperstein, Brown Class of 2005. I'm the communication chair of the Brown Club of DC, which is hosting this current installment. And BCDC is joined in this season of One Bear, One Book by the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco and the Brown Club of Boston, which have hosted prior installments. And then we have the Brown Club of Miami hosting next month, which we will tell you about later on. So stay tuned for a preview. Just to explain a bit about the series, One Bear, One Book is a virtual/hybrid alumni book club. The origin point of this, as conceived by Lisa Ryers, the president of the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco, and then executed by her along with BCDC's illustrious president, Emily Deach, class of '06, is that a lot of us in Brown alumni world, for the first time, actually got out of our geographies and specific affinities during the pandemic and started to collaborate on virtual programming. And once we started to go back towards in-person events, wanted to keep that alive. And that became the idea of doing a virtual/hybrid book club. And so the idea is that each participating group or club or whatever it is will choose a title that they feel reflects something that their community, either their location or their group or something they want to hear. And then we'll host a program around it. We'll get discussants, either the author or others, usually folks from Brown alumni world, if possible. And we'll convene that. And then we'll also convene an in-person gathering in their location. And then folks can join from throughout the world and also, if desired, do their own little book club style gatherings. And so this is our third go at it. We've had some amazing programs. Some of you might have been on this fall when the Brown Club of Boston had Ruth Simmons discussing her memoir. And it's just been a really, really fun time. And so this program will proceed according to that. We are really, really privileged to have Richard Slotkin here to discuss his work on American cultural myths and how they speak to this current moment, and what a moment it is here in DC, to say the least. So, that was obviously not planned per se, but that's what we have. In terms of how this is going to work, so we asked that folks stay muted throughout the program and enter any questions you have into the chat box. Basically, Rich and our moderator, Kara Wyman, will have a little bit of a discussion, and then they will give way to audience questions, which I will be sort of, grabbing out of the chat box and framing to them. So put your questions in the chat box and we will go from there. And really, really looking forward to this amazing program. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Kara and Rich.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Sean and Emily and everyone who contributed to organizing this evening. We are lucky indeed. I'm Kara Wyman. I am Brown class of '92, as well as the parent of a daughter who graduated last spring and a son who is a freshman this fall. So lots of great Brown connections and memories, and I'm thrilled that we have Brown folks from all over the country based on what's happening in the chat. Thank you all for joining tonight. We have with us a man who certainly needs no introduction in the field of American studies, but let me nonetheless give you all a little bit about Richard Slotkin's background. Rich has asked me to call him Rich. I asked him whether I should be calling him Professor Slotkin, but he prefers Rich. So Rich is Olin Professor of American Studies Emeritus at Wesleyan University, where he began teaching in 1966. His most recent book, of course, is A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America, which was published in 2024. And it was long-listed for the National Book Award. His best-known work is a trilogy of scholarly books that traces the myth of the frontier in American cultural history from the colonial period all the way through to, obviously, the present. Regeneration Through Violence, published in 1973, was a finalist for the National Book Award and received the Albert Beveridge Award of the American Historical Association. Gunfighter Nation, The Myth of the Frontier in 20th Century America, published in 1992, was a finalist for the 1993 National Book Award. Rich has published studies of race and politics in World War I and the Civil War. He's also, and I love seeing this, written 4 works of historical fiction, one of which, Abe, a novel of the young Lincoln, received the Shara Award for Civil War Fiction in 2001. In 1995, he received the Mary C. Turpie Award of the American Studies Association for his contributions to teaching and program building in American studies. So quite an illustrious background, Rich. Thank you so much for joining us. I explained through Emily to Rich that I feel doubly connected to Rich because 2 of my 3 children are Brown connected, but my 3rd child is a senior at Wesleyan this year and having a fabulous experience there. So 2 very, very fine institutions, and your contributions to Wesleyan are deep as well. So thank you for all your contributions. I thought maybe we could start tonight, Rich, with just a little bit of your personal story. What about your time growing up influenced your scholarship, and were you always interested in and taken with the notion of myths?
Well, I was always interested in American history. I was born in 1942, really came to consciousness at the end of the Second World War and just afterwards. It was a time of intense patriotism, linked in our household and in much of the country with liberalism and a kind of left orientation. So I was always fascinated by American history. My folklore growing up were Western movies, which were ostensibly American history, and war movies, because war was, for me, the American war was the great mystery. It was where my father spent my babyhood. And then when I was in elementary school, we followed the Korean War in our issues of Junior Scholastic. But what really did it for me, in 1951, when I was 9, my family took a driving trip down to visit some relatives in Florida. And we stopped at the Gettysburg battlefield. And I just got into it. The Civil War, Abraham Lincoln fighting off the Confederacy and Pickett's charge. I really got into the Lincoln thing. And then we drove south into the Jim Crow South. And in one of the first stops, I inadvertently crossed the color line. I went into a colored bathroom, not knowing what that meant, and got humiliated for doing that. And so it was a formative experience that the history was not the past. The history was alive, and it could hurt you. And for that reason, one had to study it. One had to really get into it and get some control of it by understanding it.
Thank you so much for that background. It's so interesting how those experiences can be so influential. Was your family supportive of your interest in history? Did they share it?
Oh yeah, for sure. The whole idea of the Gettysburg trip was their notion. Yeah, they supported it very much.
That's fantastic. So, Rich, can you share a little bit for those who may not know the full history of American studies as a discipline?
Yeah.
What that was about and how kind of radical it was at the time?
Yeah, it really started developing in the 1920s and 30s, which was a time right after the First World War when there was a real obsession with trying to define American national identity in the wake of the transformations at the turn of the century, the participation in the European War, and also the transformation of the population by massive immigration. So this is the era of the great American novel, trying to come up with a work of art that will define the nation. And American Studies is an academic response to that spirit. And it really catches on as a field, and I think becomes formalized in the 1940s. In the wake of the Second World War and the United States emergence as the global superpower, fighting first Nazism and then opposing the spread of communism. And so you needed to look at the notion of nationality. But the American Studies approach was also interdisciplinary. In the simplest terms, it was making a connection between artistic production and the production of politics. That the play with symbols that we see in literature, the great American novel, was also to be seen in the language was shared with the language of politics, and that it was possible to have a kind of integrated study of American nationality that partook of all the varied disciplines, the social sciences and the liberal arts. And that's what attracted me to it. It was the omnivorousness of the field, the idea that I could sign up and not just study American history, but American literature and American art at the same time.
It's such a that interdisciplinary way of thinking. I think all of us who were lucky enough to study at Brown and experience the new curriculum,
Yes,
that fosters that kind of thinking for sure. And so to that point, I'm curious to know how your time at Brown influenced your approach to the discipline and your approach to studies more generally.
yeah. Well, so it was interesting at Brown at the time that I was there, which was 1963 to 66. American Studies had historians and literary people, they were the mainstays, working together, but not really sharing in an interdisciplinary kind of way. The historians were over here and the literary people were over there. And the project that I came up with was really interdisciplinary. I was using the literary productions of colonial settlers to see if I could figure out the origins of American nationality, America's national culture, developing in that period of very early settlement. And it actually kind of made some of my professors a little uneasy. But I luckily found a historian, Jack Thomas, who said, just do it. And that was kind of the spirit of the Brown program, was basically just do it.
Was your advisor on the history side or the literary side? Was it?
He was on the
Professor
history
Thomas?
side, even though most of my work was done on the literary side. And that was the proof that Brown was actually open to this kind of thing happening. So then the real thing, the real sort of aha moment was this is the way it worked. I was taking a course in colonial literature, which I was doing because I needed a spot to fill, and it looked good. And I discovered that colonial literature is divided up into what we would, if we were in film studies, we would call genres. Captivity narratives, Indian war narratives, revival sermons, artillery company sermons, various genres. And two of the genres, the Indian war narrative and the Indian captivity narrative, I soon realized, were Westerns. The basic plot of every Western I'd ever seen was in the two narratives. Okay, there's a connection. And then the Vietnam War was happening while I was doing this. And the leaders who were trying to sell the Vietnam War, explain the Vietnam War to the American people, used the language of Western movies. I remember, I think it was Maxwell Taylor who explained strategic Hamlet's tactics by saying, you can't plant corn unless you move the Indians away from the stockade. So I realized that I'm dealing with 17th century texts, and the material that I'm finding there runs right through to my childhood and to my adulthood in the Vietnam War. So that was the clue that I might be on to something there. And so I really got into that colonial stuff. My first book was really traced from the colonial period to, I guess, to Moby Dick would probably be the way to describe that. But it was the idea of finding a cultural pattern, which I would call myth. And I guess that's the operative term here. at the time, myth symbol theories were the mainstay of American studies, but there really was no theory of myth. It was really themes
Uh-huh.
and images. And what I tried to do was to develop a theory of myth as the formulation of history, of a usable past, to create a usable past for the nation state specifically, and that these texts that I was working with were the rudimentary seeds, the basic elements of what would become, what was not at the time, but would become over time a national mythology, which I called the myth of the frontier.
Isn't that amazing that the class that you were not that excited about
Yes.
ended up being the one that kind of ignited the spark?
Yeah, it was, and it was a great class. It was a small class. It was taught in the John Carter Brown Library, surrounded by these ancient musty texts, and it was just terrific. It was immersion in source materials in a way that was kind of unique.
That's amazing. It's funny. You might have read my mind. I was picturing you on campus and going to these classes, and I was going to ask you if there was a particular place you like to study, but John Carter Brown, you can't get much better than that.
Yeah, well, I like the main library too.
The Rock.
The Rock, yeah, the Rock was good, and there was another place. Now I'm sorry, I'm going blank on it. That where we studied for our orals,
Oh, wow.
overlooking a dining area that was kind of nice. It must have been a small room
Maybe
that was.
maybe Fonts in Fonts
That's
house.
probably what it was. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, right
yeah,
on the main green. That's
yeah. But I
great.
was married, so I didn't hang out on campus all that much.
Already married and doing all your graduate work. That's amazing. Did the project that you worked on at Brown become the seed of your first book?
It did, yeah, and it really went from the research, a pair of research papers. It was a 2 semester course to the dissertation, and then I turned it into the book Regeneration Through Violence. But again, my advisors, when I turned in the dissertation, they said, "Look, this is a book. Take a little time away from it, then go back and turn it into a book." And then they gave me some suggestions how to do that, which I
That's
probably didn't take, but
Well, you knew what you were doing, obviously. Well, I'm interested. Your book feels so, your most recent book, I should say, A Great Disorder, feels so very timely in the moment that we find ourselves in. Um, but yet it really is the culmination of decades of scholarship and draws heavily from your prior books. Can you give us a little bit of background? It's so interesting to hear about process from authors, about when you started this particular work and what your thinking was, and the kind of big, I guess, coincidence, serendipity of it coming out in this
yeah.
moment. I'm curious to hear your reactions to that.
Well, I had started sometime after after the 2000. I had been thinking that I should go back into the study of myth and go beyond the myth of the frontier. I had done some research on the Civil War, and had really gotten interested in the way in which Civil War memory is perpetuated mythologically and critically through the society. So I'd come up with an idea to do a study of what I called 4 basic national myths, which were the main stories that Americans have used over time to organize their thinking about the nation state, where it comes from and what its purposes are. So the frontier was the most basic one, where we define ourselves as white and as becoming wealthy and powerful by seizing and exploiting natural resources in a fabulous legacy of natural resources. And that the second one was clearly the founding, that we have the state was founded by a group of very wise and virtuous white men, who bequeathed us 2 sacred documents, the Constitution and the Declaration, which interestingly enough contradict each other. One is a document of law and order, and the other is a revolutionary statement of the right to overthrow any government that you've got. Kind of nice. And then, of course, the Civil War, and two basic versions: the Liberation, Union, Emancipation version, centering on Lincoln, and the Lost Cause, the South's irredentist view of the past and its use of that myth of the past to justify violence against Reconstruction and later the establishment of Jim Crow. And then lastly, the myth that I had grown up with in a way most close to myself, which was what I called the myth of the Good War, the Second World War, which is the only one of these myths in which the United States is represented as a multi-ethnic and multiracial society. A platoon of soldiers, mixed platoon, united fighting against a common enemy. I note with dismay the attack on diversity in the armed forces right now, which is a direct attack on that myth and the values of tolerance that and of responsible foreign policy that were implicit in the Good War myth. So anyway, there were these four stories, but it was a very academic project, and those are not easy to sell. And then MAGA happened, and Charlottesville happened, and I looked at the banners and then of course January 6th, and I looked at the banners that were being waved in those violent moments, as well as the rhetoric. And the banners were the banners of the national myths that I've been talking about, or some of them anyway. The myth of the frontier, vigilantism, gun rights, the use of violence to establish your kind of regime, an exploitive economy, founding, Second Amendment again, and above all, the Civil War, the Confederate battle flag, and the Lost Cause being flown over those crowds. The rattlesnake flag, so-called Gadsden
Don't
flag,
tread on me.
Don't Tread on Me, which is a revolutionary flag, but it's essentially the flag of the gun rights movement, which became in the 90s an anti-government movement. And so I realized that the language, the symbols that I was talking about were not simply latent in American consciousness, but that they had been activated in very powerful ways. And that was the idea of the book. It was to set the scene, establish the language of mythology, show how it had evolved up to the 21st century, and then show it operating through the battles of the Obama and Trump eras.
Wow. So it was really in am I getting the chronology right, around 2020 that the book in its current incarnation?
No, it actually, in its current incarnation, it really took shape, I would say, in 2018.
2018. Okay.
2018.
So
that is right after Charlottesville is 2017.
Okay, perfect. Yep.
2018 is when I really was finally willing to commit to writing this one. And then as I was writing it, stuff kept happening. And the January 6th, which is in a sense the conclusion of the main part of the text, I was ready to submit the manuscript at that point, and then had to rewrite the conclusion. And then by the time that everything else worked out, I was looking ahead to the 2024 election by the time final copy was in. And I knew that there was going to be a year. So I had to say something about 2024 without committing myself to.
No, wait, what was going to be? Wow.
No, I said it could go either way.
Yeah.
And that even if it didn't go MAGA's way this time, that the division of the country was so close that at some point it was going to happen.
Yeah. Well, prescient for sure, as we find ourselves, especially, I think post January 20th or whatever the day was. It's been quite a ride already.
Yeah.
The notion of myths is a really fascinating and powerful notion. And so I think that you've hit on that as the anchor for how you're thinking about these stories that are so crucial to national identity. I'm curious, in a more abstract way, what about myths is useful, and then what is dangerous? And I'm curious whether you've seen national myth making play out differently in different national contexts and different historical contexts.
Well, it is very powerful, and because it's powerful, it is always dangerous. It's a way of organizing your thinking about history. Every narrative, myth is always narrative, and every narrative has an implicit theory of cause and effect. The difference between ideology and myth is that myth doesn't argue. It doesn't give you propositions. It says, this is what happened. This is why it happened. If you're a believer, if you identify with the myth, if you identify with the lost cause, then you are in a movie and you know how to act and you know what is justified, what you're justified in doing. And that can be a powerful force for good, and it can be a powerful force for evil. One of the things that I came in the past, I think I had always taken a kind of rationalist view that my role as a historian was to demystify, debunk the myth, and come to some sort of rational place on the other side of myth where you are no longer subject to it. And I still believe that something like that has to be possible. But I also think that mythological thinking is so basic to human psychology that unless you have a myth, unless you have a good myth, you're not going to be able to stand up with the same kind of emotional commitment that the bad guys have. Now we have had mythic stories that worked that way. The Good War was a very powerful one, and it affected not only the stuff like getting involved in Vietnam, but it also affected the success of the civil rights movement. It made that possible.
Mm-hmm.
Two historical episodes, let's call them, that should be mythic and aren't functionally in the society: the New Deal and the civil rights movement. That is, we know the story of the New Deal. So in a sense, there is a myth of the New Deal. Grapes of Wrath, FDR. But it hasn't been absorbed into the mainstream of public mythological thinking in the way that the frontier has. How many movies have you seen about union organizing in the 1930s? Great story, but nobody ever made that movie. Yet, Grapes of the one movie you have about the Depression is Grapes of Wrath, which is kind of a Western. The civil rights movement was a powerful national movement which did affect national politics and national life in extremely powerful ways, but it never became a unifying national myth. It fragmented into movements of various oppressed and marginalized groups to establish their rights. It was not adopted nationally, despite the Martin Luther King holiday, as an American story. It is their story. It's those people's story. And that's a failure of the imagination, the public imagination, perhaps a failure of media as well, failure to tell the story. But I guess the story is there, and people need to use recall to remember these things and to tell the story. And then maybe it becomes mythic down the road.
Thank you so much. Well, I have had the pleasure of asking lots of questions.
Excuse me.
But I want to make sure that our One Bear, One Book participants are also able to ask some questions. So the first one that came through in the chat is from William Grace Frost, class of 74. And it actually, William, great minds think alike, because I also was called to think about Joseph Campbell's work on mythology. And William's question was to you, Rich, were you any way influenced by Joseph Campbell's extensive work on mythology? And if so, in what way?
Yes, I was. And I had a really good course called Indo-European Myth and Legend at Brooklyn College when I was an undergraduate, and got to know Campbell's work and also James George Fraser's The Golden Bough. And what I took from him is the pattern finding. That you read a group of stories and they seem all different, and then you realize that there's an underlying structural similarity, and it links the stories one to another. And I spun that out in time, whereas he spins it out in, in depth. Where I departed from Campbell is in what was then very important as a theory in anthropology and the study of myth, the theory of archetypes. And this comes out of Jungian psychology as well. And while I recognize that there are some patterns that repeat so often that they seem like universals, that what is interesting is not the sameness of these stories, but their difference. The fact that one culture chooses a warrior hero and another chooses a saint. That one has features a female in the leading role, and the others relegate females only to secondary roles. That one is a story of war, and another is a story of discovery. And that in those differences, we see not only the differences between cultures, but the differences in the use of the same myth in different periods of its development. Indian bad in the colonial period, Indian good in the 20th century version of the Westerns. Same language, but the radical change is what marks the development through historical time.
That's such a fascinating different lens, the finding the similarities across cultures or contexts versus looking at the same culture over time and in different eras. William asked a follow-up question to that while we're on Joseph Campbell's worldview. Is it possible that the country is following Campbell's detailing of the hero's journey?
Well, of course. It's hard not to. The way Campbell's works things out. But I guess I'd be hard put to say who the hero of this story is. Trump clearly thinks that he's the hero. No one has suffered as I have. No one has been assailed as I have. No one has had to overcome the ordeals that I have had. Who is the shadow presence, the dark twin that Trump overcomes? I think he can be pushed too far. In other words, and I think where you would find the Campbellian structures is in popular culture stories, which set a kind of structural frame for Trump. I'm thinking here, and I'm sorry that I've forgotten the person's name, did a really good article, I think it was in the Times, placing Trump's persona in relation to superheroes in the Marvel universe. And if you look at the superheroes in the Marvel universe, they should be paying Campbell royalties because they all follow the Campbellian pattern. But what affects MAGA from that is they're not living out the specific story, but their heroes have that frame. I would say that you should look more to the national myths, the myths about the formation of nationality to understand something like Trump.
Thank you so much. I have another question in the chat. when did your thinking pivot from viewing your intellectual role as one of a myth debunker to one who embraces the power of myth and supports finding healthier ones? Was there a particular moment for that?
No, because that's why I wrote historical fiction. That the theory that I was working on as a scholar was, okay, there are these works of fiction. They establish a set of images and ideas which become the public mythology. Well, two can play at that game. So why don't I try to produce uh, my own stories, my own literature, my own version of the myth? And the novels that I've written all, in one way or another, address the mythic materials, because they, in a way, all of them came out of my research. There was always a story in the research that I couldn't handle as a scholar for psychological reasons or for lack of resources. So I did a novel about the Battle of the Crater before I was really ready to write about the Civil War, and a novel about Lincoln. And I did a Western called The Return of Henry Starr, and a short story called Greenhorns about Jews escaping from Russia and coming as immigrants to this country. So it all came out of, but so I've tended to alternate between debunking the myth, analyzing, and trying to fabricate a story that has the power of myth, but speaks to the good side, hopefully.
Can you tell us a little? I'm fascinated to hear from authors about their process, and I would imagine that the process of writing the deep scholarship that you have done is quite different from writing a novel of historical fiction. I mean, there are certain elements, I'm sure, that obviously overlap. You have such command of the details of the period, for example, the setting and all of that would, and the places in your novels that connect to real moments in history. Obviously, you have a lot of background there, but building a narrative and a fictional story feels like a very different part of one's brain. Tell me about that experience.
Well, there was an article, and again, I blank on the other. History has lived and history has written, and as a scholar, it's history has written. As a novelist, it's history has lived. The difference in the process is, okay, I know these things. I have this. The history gives me a story. The history gives me a setting. Who am I in that setting? What does it feel like to be this person in that setting? That kind of person in that setting. How do I deal with that world? What do I see? What do I smell? What do I taste? How is my imagination constricted by what by where I am and by who I am in that place? That's the real difference. It's the subjectivity that one gets into with that, and then you're off in a different. Then in a sense you've done the research. I've done the research, and then I'm exploring the research as this person that has to live it. And
I love that.
Yeah,
I love that. That's a great way of thinking about it. Thank you for sharing that. Question in the chat from someone who is curious about the framed art or artifact that is on the left of our screens. I guess it's over your right shoulder behind you.
Yeah, it's a Navajo sand painting.
Tell us more about the history, if you would.
Well, we bought it at I think it was at Mesa Verde National Park on a trip that we took in the early 70s, and I loved it. I love that the Navajo art. We've got a whole bunch of pottery and stuff like that. It's the water creatures who are creation spirits from the four directions. I like to have them looking over my shoulder.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Keep me grounded.
That's beautiful. I love that. Lisa Ryers from San Francisco, of our San Francisco group, class of 90. Thank you, Lisa, for joining. Has a question, which I think is very relevant. In the era of social media carrying the day, do you think that anti-MAGA factions are capable of coming up with a 21st century version of the good war to do some MAGA myth busting? Seems like they would have to be visually translated, is Lisa's
Yeah.
observation.
Well, it's a complex question, and focusing on social media is one way of doing that. It's not. It's a hard thing to understand. I'm kind of out of date on that. Uh, Someone said, why doesn't the left have Joe Rogan? Well, because Joe Rogans don't live on the left. Joe Rogan is selling supplements, and that's why people started watching him. So what? I should start selling supplements. And in the past, uh, the big media was a vehicle for addressing uh, the issues raised by myth. Take the myth of the frontier, for example. In the early 1950s, during the Red Scare, and with Jim Crow still being defended, you had a bunch of Westerns made about coexistence and peace between Indians and whites. And it was a coded message about race relations and also a coded message about the Cold War. An artist could use public media to make a kind of a statement that would, in the terms of the myth, that would also open the myth up to the possibility of change. I don't know where the media are to do that today. Some of the legacy media are still there and are still powerful and are still operating, I gather, on various streaming services as well as in Hollywood. But it's difficult to imagine how it's done. I guess I really think that activism will set the terms and provide the scripts for whatever new story is going to follow. You see some of it in the reaction against Musk and Doge. You've got a story there with a villain, which is always good for narrative. But it's hard to see such a narrative getting going. The good war narrative as a possibility is a really tough one because the good war narrative was misused for 2 generations. That it was misused in Vietnam, it was badly misused in the Gulf War and in the Iraq War. And people look at it and say, well, yeah, Munich and appeasement, right? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So people aren't buying it. And that makes it hard. My feeling is civil rights movement, activism, that this is a mode of action and therefore a mode of storytelling which has possibilities and which has other uses as well, more concrete uses in building resistance.
Thank you for that. Paul put in the chat that he's reminded of our national myths about immigration.
Mm-hmm.
We have, the historical melting pot and strength through diversity. And he asks if you could reflect on the current round of myth making related to immigration.
Well, there's 2 ways of thinking about the people beyond the border. One is that they're coming to join us, and the other is that they're invading, and we've gotten into invasion mode. We've been there before. That was the great reaction against immigration in the 1920s, the early 1920s, that produced the Johnson-Reed Act that established what they called racial quotas for immigration. Race then meaning what we would call ethnicity or nationality as a category. And what you got after that was a cutoff of immigration, but the assimilation of the masses of immigrants who had come between 1880 and 1920 to become mainstream, to become politically empowered. But becoming politically empowered in this country sometimes translates as becoming white. And white has always been an exclusive term in our mythology. So if that's where we are with this, that's what if we're thinking about looking at the immigrants from a whites versus Indian perspective, then we're not in favor of
Mhm.
immigration.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that even people who are recent immigrants have said, frankly, they're pulling the ladder up after them. So it is a real change, and it's a profound issue. It even seems to have produced some kind of consensus, but remains to be seen. There's still a reality of the people who are here, and we have to see what happens with that.
Absolutely. Um, I'm going to switch gears for a second because among other things noted on your Wesleyan um, biography, actually, let me start there, which is you have you're a professor emeritus now, but you were a professor for many decades.
Yeah.
What were the qualities that you enjoyed in your students?
Oh God, Wesleyan students were extremely smart and extremely they were activists, and they had opinions. And you never had a problem, getting a response from a Wesleyan student audience. So it was great, and I was able to work with them on since it was a small school, relatively speaking, both in lecture mode and also in small seminars and supervising undergraduate theses, two of which turned into books.
Oh, isn't that fun?
Yeah, it was fun. And it's great to take somebody through that whole process. And I never really missed not having graduate students for that reason. I felt I was dealing with the basics. The other thing was that having to reframe my ideas for really smart and feisty undergraduates improved me as a writer, uh, so that I feel I've been able to avoid jargon, and become a good explainer, thanks to my students.
That's fabulous. Um, where I was going to go is you were instrumental, it said on the Wesleyan website, its biography of you in establishing Wesleyan's film studies
Yes.
department, which is fascinating. And I love how interdisciplinary all your work has been. But I think this group could use some movie recommendations from you. So do you have one or two of movies that are can't miss?
Uh, that are current? None.
Doesn't have to be
They all
current.
they
Doesn't
all
have to
miss.
be all the better
Well,
if you're not.
my tastes really run to the classics. I still think High Noon is a great movie. I think The Searchers is a great movie, but though it needs careful reading. Um, and yeah,
I
that
Noon and The
era.
Searchers. We're gonna have to put it on all of our lists.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. I've got a great question from Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manoso, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Tell us a healthy myth for new hope in not losing our Constitution and rebuilding institutional guardrails.
Ah, um, I guess the what comes closest to that would be the what I called the liberation myth of the Civil War, where you have a country which the Constitution is torn apart. The country is torn apart. It literally breaks up, and then it gets put back together, um, partly by Lincoln during the war. And then after the war, with the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, which rebuild the nation on a completely different basis. Instead of its being a white man's country, they try at least to establish the principle that all people born in the United States are citizens, meaning specifically blacks born in this country are citizens. Indians are another problem, but there's the principle established. So to me, that's of all the historical myths, that's the one that comes closest to what you're asking for. If we were to take a serious look at the New Deal, you'd find something comparable there. The nation didn't fall apart, but it looked pretty much like it was going to, and it didn't. What was it that enabled that to work? It was the government cooperating with various underclasses in the society, working with the labor movement, the government acting to regulate the unrestrained power of capital, which had produced the Depression. There are lessons to be learned there, despite the obvious imperfections of the New Deal, for going forward. And that's the point of myth. What happened in the myth isn't the perfect answer. It's not a utopian plan, but it gives you a sense of the kind of thing that might work, the kinds of action that might work.
Thank you, Rich. Rita Ballesteros asks, what are you working on now? What will you delve into next?
That's a tough question. I don't know. I'm still working op-eds off this book, and I'm trying to think of something to say in response to what we're seeing in Washington right now, which looks suspiciously like an authoritarian takeover, or at least an attempt at that, and also the reestablishment of white supremacy as a given of the way American society operates. Some response is necessary, but I haven't figured out what kind of intervention I can make at this point beyond what I've already done. But you've asked the question that haunts me.
Well, we know you're going to keep going. You have too many good ideas to stop now. Amy says, I see a relationship between the myth of the founding and the practice of originalism in our Supreme Court. And Amy's wondering whether you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is pure mythological thinking. That we're going back to the origins, to the founding fathers. We're recovering their consciousness, and we're reestablishing their world. And that they, as Justice Thomas said, that their ideas are easy to, and their meanings and intentions are easy to read. Well, they were some of the most complicated and difficult and contradictory people who ever lived. Easy to read my butt. So yeah, it is pure mythological thinking. And where the mythological comes into play most obviously is in the gun rights movement, which fetishizes a particular reading of the Second Amendment, which, you pardon me if I get technical, the Palladium Doctrine, which is an 1830s doctrine, which holds that the Second Amendment protects the right of states to form militias for the purpose someday of resisting a tyrannical government. And that's been translated through the originalism into an individual right, which it never was. So much for originalism, but that's the myth of originalism. And that it gives individuals a right to arm themselves to resist the government. So you get Second Amendment remedies to Obamacare. You get people bringing AR-15s to school board meetings. And the whole paranoia about the liberals taking over the government, needing to be resisted violently. And that's originalism, the myth of originalism on steroids.
A dangerous example of where it can take off and go in a sideways, I guess. See, I'm looking at the questions here. You were talking before about some of the positive myths, and Dr. Barbara also asked whether there was a new Abe Lincoln that you could think of who could maybe help achieve some of these more positive mythical directions that some of us might like to see take root in our country.
Well, you never know you've got Abe Lincoln till after he's dead. Oh, what a great man he was, the one we called the original gorilla. Yes, oh yes, the man with no manners, the country bumpkin. Yeah, it turns out he was the greatest president ever. So there's that. But I mean, if you're asking, are there examples, are there exemplary figures that we could point to as a way of dealing with the moment? Yeah, I definitely would say Lincoln. I would say in some ways Washington, because he gave up power. when he didn't have to. Um, whereas Lincoln stretched the law a good bit in order to save the country. I can see Trump appealing to that. FDR, who stayed within the boundaries of the law, but changed the law in order to make it work. I think that would be a useful example. And Obama, because he represents the nationalization of the civil rights movement, which is a critical thing to recognize.
Rich, we have about 3 minutes left. Any
Okay.
final parting words of advice for this group of people who I think care deeply about our country and look to you for the light that you have shown on where things are today?
Well, I guess the main thing is this, that is, I write about the power of myth, but myths always arise from events, and events are made by people. So, instead of I guess some people should be working on a new narrative, people whose specialty is the making of narratives, but everybody else should just make history, should get out there, organize, do a thing. Maybe the event that you stage will be the kickoff of a new American story.
Well, those are amazing parting words. Rich, I think that all of your comments have been so inspiring and
Thank you.
illuminating. The moment I loved the best, though, was when you spoke about your students and your face just lit up. And I feel like those of us on this call have been lucky enough to be metaphorically in your students' seats for the last hour. And what a pleasure it has been and a gift it has been to all of us. Thank you so much for your work, for your scholarship, for your teaching, and for spending this hour with us tonight. It has been just a joy and really fabulous.
It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to close here with a few just closing words from BCDC. So thank you so much to Rich Slotkin for joining us and really making this such a wonderful conversation. Thank you to Kara for moderating. Special thanks to Evelyn and Victoria from our team, who did an amazing job of organizing our in-person gathering here. You can see them if they can wave on the camera, the folks who are gathered here. Evelyn Sayers and Victoria Sams did an absolutely just phenomenal job getting us together and getting this event together. And yes, Brown Club of DC, obviously, if you all want to follow us, whether you are in the DC area or from afar, our website is brownindc.org. And you can follow us on Instagram at Brown Club of DC. We are also on Facebook. Of course, for those of you in the DC area, the best way to support us is to be a dues-paying member, which allows us to put on events like this and subsidize costs for making it affordable for all, letting Brown students who are spending the semester in DC participate, and all sorts of other good things. Finally, the One Bear, One Book series continues next month on March 23rd with the Brown Club of Miami, as we mentioned earlier. I threw the registration link to that in the chat. They will be having a discussion of Bad Monkey by Carl Hiaasen. So a little bit of a shift in direction, but towards some of the fun characters that inhabit the world of Florida. That's also, I believe that book has become a streaming series recently. So they will be holding a discussion with a University of Miami lecturer and creative writer. They will also be holding an in-person gathering hosted by Kim Arredondo at her home that those of you who are in South Florida could potentially attend. So look that up and consider joining us. And thank you all so much.